Hello, and welcome to my first video. To start off, we're taking a look at official publicly released prototypes. The first thing to note here is the meaning of publicly released. In this case, I'm referring to prototypes released for the public to play at home, not something shown at a trade show or event such as E3. The concept of displaying prototypes at public events actually dates back to Pong in 1972, which was initially demonstrated at Cap's Tavern in August of that year. You could also technically count the especially early game Birdie the Brain as well, which was publicly demonstrated at the Canadian National Exhibition in 1950, but the fact the game never received a wider release past that makes it a bit of a questionable example. As for prototypes playable at home, there seems to be three major examples that happened about a year apart each. Our story starts in 1994, where Sega launched Sega Channel. A precursor to modern digital distribution, Sega allowed subscribers to not only download and play a selection of regular games, but time-limited trials of recently released and upcoming games as well. Unfortunately, the lack of game preservation efforts at the time have left us with an incomplete game schedule, as well as very little archived copies of Sega Channel exclusive content, officially released or otherwise. Regardless, the info we do have can give us a basic example of the sort of early releases subscribers could play. On February 1st, 1995, the test drive section, as it was called at the time, allowed users to play Ristar 16 days before it was released on cartridge. It's unknown what, if any, differences the game had during this period compared to the final build, but the fact is this, with the remaining info we have, appears to be the first time the test drive section had a game available before release. Moving on to 1996, id Software was gearing up to release Quake on MS-DOS systems, but before the launch, they came up with the idea to test out the multiplayer functionality with fans. The result was Q-Test, described as a public test of Quake's network, sound, and video technology in the README file. It was released on id's website at February 24th, 1996. In terms of content, it featured 3 early versions of the deathmatch maps included in the final version of Quake, as well as several early monster models that, while never meant to be used in this multiplayer-only build, still managed to be accessed by hackers before the final version launched. But that, of course, was basically a multiplayer beta made several years before it became a common concept in the industry. The idea of releasing a prototype of an already released game for historical purposes, however, only required one more year of wait time. On January 29th, 1997, Duke Nukem 3D celebrated its first anniversary. The game had already taken the world by storm at this point, and the now legendary For All the Wrong Reasons sequel wouldn't be announced until about 3 months later, or released until 14 years and 1 month later, for that matter. So with nothing else to do to celebrate the date, 3D Realms suddenly dropped an early build of the game, dated to January 3rd, 1995, on their official website. The build, referred to as Lame Duke by the team, showed a drastically different take on the game, resembling the first 2 games more closely and lacking none of the baldy, heavily pop culture reference-fueled humor that the final game infamously included. And with the history of prototypes talked about, it's now time to get into the main subject here. Where are the prototypes? As you probably already figured out from the description, devs releasing prototypes for historical reasons is unfortunately a rather uncommon sight. Aside from the earliest example, Lame Duke, some fairly notable occasions have included M2 secretly bundling in a Gunstar Heroes prototype as part of one of their PS2 Sega Ages collections, Traveler's Tales founder John Burton dropping a Pugsy tech demo by turning it into a rapidly flashing YouTube video, and 3D Realms continuing right where they left off with Duke, suddenly releasing 10 different Shadow Warrior prototypes as part of an update for the Steam release of the game in 2017. The first and most obvious issue here is a fear of bugs and glitches for some reason. Despite living in a world where games are constantly released in early access, or tested with betas of varying degrees of openness, or even straight up running a test server for already released games to test updates, the mere concept of an ancient unfinished build of an unreleased game crashing an emulator seems to be enough to scare off devs. Just look at Rare Replay, for example. In a post-release article talking about the game's development, they brought up plans to include a variety of prototypes as unlockable content, naming Black Widow, Cameo 2, Tailwind, and the GBA Battletoads game as examples. But, unfortunately, fears of the supposedly necessary extra work, cauterizing the rough edges, and cordoning off a playable experience within each unfinished build quickly killed off those plans. What we got instead? Videos. Lots of videos. Videos of prototypes people have been dreaming of playing for years. Project Dream on both the Super Nintendo and Nintendo 64, 12 Tales Conquer 64, all clearly dumped and running on an emulator, possibly even recorded with the internal ones they made for the collection. It shouldn't be too hard to understand why there's a massive problem here. Games are designed to be interactive. By only showing brief video footage of these prototypes, players miss out on a lot of context by not being able to experience the builds themselves. The fact is, games being released in an unfinished state is incredibly common nowadays, so there shouldn't be any problems with including an unreleased emulated prototype in your game collection. And that's not even getting into content accessible outside of the normal parts of the prototype. Going back to Q-Test, remember all those early monster models? Imagine if it never released it publicly, instead getting a random employee to record and upload footage of it online years later. We wouldn't have those hackers finding the unused data in the build, and the models would be lost to time. The fact that games don't exist as a single static thing like a movie or a song means that unused content can occasionally be hidden in the files. That's why sites like the cutting room floor exist, and by keeping your prototypes locked up, only to be shown as a smaller clip in a large video, people don't have the ability to find such content. Of course, there's the issue of Rare Replay being an Xbox One exclusive game, and by being locked to a console with no PC release, there would be no real way to extract anything from said protos for the time being. But that could theoretically be worked around, maybe by Rare hiring a game archaeologist of sorts to dig through the data for them, or just waiting for the time it is possible to extract data from Xbox One games. The second and more notable issue is copyright issues. Let's say your prototype includes some licensed music as a background track, or maybe you used a scene ripped from a movie as an intro before the actual intro was finalized. Fortunately, it's not too hard to fix this either. Just look at Volition. Back in January 2016, they teamed up with Unseen 64 to revive an unreleased PSP game known as Saints Row Undercover. The last version of it they made was released for free on their site, with one small catch. As it turns out, the build contained a bunch of licensed music ripped from Saints Row 2.
A lot of the radio stations were being ported over from Saints Row 2.
There are, however, because in this game, I dug through the files of it, there is all the songs that were going to be for the radio stations were already in there. You couldn't play them in-game, but they were there. But Mike and I weren't able to identify some of the songs, so...
None of it was actually used in the build, but they made it clear they obviously couldn't include that, and as such, the songs were removed from the publicly released version. Now compare that with the released games included in Rare Replay, where they made a massive effort to remove the names of everyone who initially published them. Surely, in this theoretical good future scenario, Rare could go through the trouble of removing any copyright infringing content from the prototypes, right? And hopefully publish a light warning explaining the content they were legally required to take out. So with those major problems repaired, I think it shouldn't be too hard to understand why devs need to release their prototypes publicly. Of course, this is just the beginning of convincing devs to achieve their history. Next time, we're looking at a lost HD remaster of a classic FPS, and the surprising place a demo of it ended up in. Thanks for watching!